Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs from the Classic Fairy Tales by Iona and Peter Opie, published by Oxford University Press, 1974. The story of Snow White was one of the tales Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm collected in Kassel from two sisters, Jeanette and Amalie Hassenpflug, whose brother Ludwig was to marry their sister Lotte. The story, a morality, perhaps, on the spitefulness of which beauty queens are capable, was in fact well known in Hesse at the beginning of the 19th century, and it has subsequently been found with little variation over a wide area from Ireland to Asia Minor, and in several parts of North and West Africa. The tale contains elements that lie deep in European folk tradition, but it is not necessarily an old story, and has probably come under literary influence. Thus the theme of the glass coffin in which lay Snow White's body, remaining ever as beautiful as the day it was laid to rest, was a feature of the story of Lisa in the Pentamerone, published in 1634. Lisa, like Snow White, was a lovely 7-year-old child, and she died, or appeared to have died, through having a comb stuck in her head. For years her body was kept secretly in a casket of crystal, and it remained lovely, so lovely that when her uncle's wife discovered it in a locked room, it aroused her most intense jealousy. Furthermore, the story in the Pentamerone, printed more than 300 years ago, throws light on an anomaly in the story of Snow White, which, to the rational-minded, if to no one else, has always seemed to need explanation. The fact that Snow White, who was 7 years old when abandoned in the woods, and apparently not much older when murdered, should be thought mature enough for marriage when the prince discovers her in her coffin. In the Pentamerone, it is explained that Lisa, after her apparent death and incarceration, continued to grow like any other girl, and the crystal casket lengthened with her, keeping pace as she grew. The tale in the Pentamerone is in fact more satisfactory than the present-day tale, in that Lisa's casket, unlike Snow White's glass coffin, was kept hidden, so no one would have seen her growing. In addition, the aunt's extreme enmity is shown to have been due to her supposing that her husband was having an affair with the beautiful girl. The aunt did not know Lisa was her husband's niece, and does not seem to have been aware that the girl had for years lain in a coma. When the aunt opens the casket, she thinks the maiden merely asleep, takes hold of her by the hair and drags her out, fortuitously dislodging the comb in her head and restoring her to life. The text that follows appeared under the name Snowdrop in German Popular Stories, translated from the Kinder and Haus Märchen, collected by M. Grimm from Oral Tradition, 1823. It was the Grimm's version of the tale which Walt Disney brought to the screen in 1938, in a cartoon film, the first of feature length, that seemed at the time a work of compelling power and humor, but which, when seen again in later years, has not lived up to the first impression. The film has, in fact, had an unfortunate effect on fairy tale illustration. It is interesting, however, that, in the film, Disney chose to re-establish an incident glossed over by the early translators, that the Queen not only ordered Snow White to be killed, but ordered that her heart be brought back as a token that the deed had been accomplished. In fact, in the German original, the story was even more unpleasant. When the servant, particularized as a huntsman, came back with the heart of a young boar he had killed, the Queen is stated to have had it salted, and to have eaten the heart in the belief that it was Sneewittchen's. To match this, the Queen's fate at the end of the story was more terrible. At the wedding feast, when the Queen's crime was exposed, slippers of iron were heated in a fire until red hot, and the Queen was forced to put them on and to dance until she dropped dead. Snowdrop. It was in the middle of winter, when the broad flakes of snow were falling around, that a certain queen sat working at a window, the frame of which was made of fine black ebony. And as she was looking out upon the snow, she pricked her finger, and 3 drops of blood fell upon it. Then she gazed thoughtfully upon the red drops which sprinkled the white snow, and said, "Would that my little daughter may be as white as that snow, as red as the blood, and as black as the ebony window frame." And so the little girl grew up. Her skin was as white as snow, her cheeks as rosy as the blood, and her hair as black as ebony, and she was called Snowdrop. But this queen died, and the king soon married another wife, who was very beautiful, but so proud that she could not bear to think that anyone could surpass her. She had a magical looking-glass, to which she used to go and gaze upon herself in it, and say, "Tell me, glass, tell me true, of all the ladies in the land, who is the fairest? Tell me who." And the glass answered, "Thou, queen, art fairest in the land." But Snowdrop grew more and more beautiful, and when she was 7 years old, she was as bright as the day, and fairer than the queen herself. Then the glass one day answered the queen, when she went to consult it as usual, "Thou, queen, mayst fair and beauteous be, but Snowdrop is lovelier far than thee." When she heard this, she turned pale with rage and envy, and called to one of her servants, and said, "Take Snowdrop away into the wide wood, that I may never see her more." Then the servant led her away, but his heart melted when she begged him to spare her life, and he said, "I will not hurt thee, thou pretty child." So he left her by herself, and though he thought it most likely that the wild beasts would tear her into pieces, he felt as if a great weight were taken off his heart when he had made up his mind not to kill her, but to leave her to her fate. Then poor Snowdrop wandered along through the wood in great fear, and the wild beasts roared about her, but none did her any harm. In the evening she came to a little cottage, and went in there to rest herself, for her little feet would carry her no further. Everything was spruce and neat in the cottage. On the table was spread a white cloth, and there were 7 little plates with 7 little loaves, and 7 little glasses with wine in them, and knives and forks laid in order, and by the wall stood 7 little beds. Then, as she was very hungry, she picked a little piece off each loaf, and drank a very little wine out of each glass, and after that she thought she would lie down and rest. So she tried all the little beds, and one was too long, and another was too short, till at last the 7th suited her, and there she laid herself down, and went to sleep. Presently in came the masters of the cottage, who were 7 little dwarfs that lived among the mountains, and dug and searched about for gold. They lighted up their 7 lamps, and saw directly that all was not right. The first said, "Who has been sitting on my stool?" The second, "Who has been eating off my plate?" The third, "Who has been picking at my bread?" The fourth, "Who has been meddling with my spoon?" The fifth, "Who has been handling my fork?" The sixth, "Who has been cutting with my knife?" The seventh, "Who has been drinking my wine?" Then the first looked round and said, "Who has been lying on my bed?" And the rest came running to him, and every one cried out that somebody had been upon his bed. But the 7th saw Snowdrop, and called all his brethren to come and see her. And they cried out with wonder and astonishment, and brought their lamps to look at her, and said, "Good heavens, what a lovely child she is!" And they were delighted to see her, and took care not to wake her. And the 7th dwarf slept an hour with each of the other dwarfs in turn, till the night was gone. In the morning Snowdrop told them all her story, and they pitied her, and said if she would keep all things in order, and cook and wash, and knit and spin for them, she might stay where she was, and they would take good care of her. Then they went out all day long to their work, seeking for gold and silver in the mountains. And Snowdrop remained at home, and they warned her. They said, "The queen will soon find out where you are, so take care and let no one in." But the queen, now that she thought Snowdrop was dead, believed that she was certainly the handsomest lady in the land, and she went to her glass and said, "Tell me, glass, tell me true, of all the ladies in the land, who is fairest? Tell me who." And the glass answered, "Thou, queen, are the fairest in all this land. But over the hills, in the greenwood shade, where the 7 dwarfs their dwelling have made, there Snowdrop is hiding her head, and she is lovelier far, O queen, than thee." Then the queen was very much alarmed, for she knew that the glass always spoke the truth, and was sure that the servant had betrayed her. And she could not bear to think that anyone lived who was more beautiful than she was. So she disguised herself as an old peddler, and went her way over the hills to the place where the dwarfs dwelt. Then she knocked at the door and cried, "Fine wares to sell." Snowdrop looked out at the window and said, "Oh, good day, good woman. What have you to sell?" "Good wares, fine wares," said she, "laces and bobbins of all colors." "I will let the lady in. She seems to be a very good sort of body," thought Snowdrop. So she ran down and unbolted the door. "Oh, bless me," said the old woman, "how badly your stays are laced. Let me lace them up with one of my nice new laces." Snowdrop did not dream of any mischief, so she stood up before the old woman, but she set to work so nimbly and pulled the lace so tight that Snowdrop lost her breath and fell down as if she were dead. "There's an end of all thy beauty," said the spiteful queen, and went away home. In the evening the 7 dwarfs returned, and I need not say how grieved they were to see their faithful Snowdrop stretched upon the ground motionless, as if she were quite dead. However, they lifted her up, and when they found out what was the matter, they cut the lace, and in a little time she began to breathe, and soon came to life again. Then they said, "The old woman was the queen herself. Take care another time, and let no one in when we are away." When the queen got home, she went straight to her glass and spoke to it as usual, but to her great surprise it still said, "Thou, queen, art the fairest in all this land, but over the hills in the greenwood shade, where the 7 dwarfs their dwelling have made, there Snowdrop is hiding her head, and she is lovelier far, O queen, than thee." Then the blood ran cold in her heart with spite and malice to see that Snowdrop still lived, and she dressed herself up again in a disguise, but very different from the one she wore before, and took with her a poisoned comb. When she reached the dwarf's cottage, she knocked at the door and cried, "Fine wares to sell," but Snowdrop said, "I dare not let anyone in." Then the queen said, "Only look at my beautiful combs," and gave her the poisoned one. And it looked so pretty that she took it up and put it into her hair to try it. But the moment it touched her head the poison was so powerful that she fell down senseless. "There you may lie," said the queen, and went her way. But by good luck the dwarfs returned very early that evening, and when they saw Snowdrop lying on the ground, they thought what had happened, and soon found the poisoned comb. And when they took it away, she recovered, and told them all that had passed, and they warned her once more not to open the door to anyone. Meantime the queen went home to her glass, and trembled with rage when she received exactly the same answer as before, and she said, "Snowdrop shall die if it costs me my life." So she went secretly into a chamber and prepared a poisoned apple. The outside looked very rosy and tempting, but whoever tasted it was sure to die. Then she dressed herself up as a peasant's wife, and travelled over the hills to the dwarf's cottage, and knocked at the door. But Snowdrop put her head out of the window and said, "I dare not let anyone in, for the dwarfs have told me not." "Do as you please," said the old woman, "but at any rate take this pretty apple. I will make you a present of it." "No," said Snowdrop, "I dare not take it." "You silly girl," answered the other, "what are you afraid of? Do you think it is poisoned? Come, do you eat one part, and I will eat the other." Now the apple was so prepared that one side was good, though the other side was poisoned. Then Snowdrop was very much tempted to taste, for the apple looked exceedingly nice. And when she saw the old woman eat, she could refrain no longer. But she had scarcely put the piece in her mouth when she fell down dead upon the ground. "This time nothing will save thee," said the queen, and she went home to her glass, and at last it said, "Thou, queen, art the fairest of all the fair." And then her envious heart was glad, and as happy as such a heart could be. When evening came, and the dwarfs returned home, they found Snowdrop lying on the ground, no breath passed her lips, and they were afraid that she was quite dead. They lifted her up, and combed her hair, and washed her face with wine and water. But all was in vain, for the little girl seemed quite dead. So they laid her down upon a bier, and all seven watched and bewailed her 3 whole days, and then they proposed to bury her, but her cheeks were still rosy, and her face looked just as it did while she was alive. So they said, "We will never bury her in the cold ground." And they made a coffin of glass, so that they might still look at her, and wrote her name upon it in golden letters, and that she was a king's daughter. And the coffin was placed upon the hill, and one of the dwarfs always sat by it and watched. And the birds of the air came too, and bemoaned Snowdrop. First of all came an owl, and then a raven, but at last came a dove. And thus Snowdrop lay for a long time, and still only looked as though she were asleep, for she was even now as white as snow, and as red as blood, and as black as ebony. At last a prince came, and called at the dwarf's house, and he saw Snowdrop, and read what was written in golden letters. Then he offered the dwarfs money, and earnestly prayed them to let him take her away. But they said, "We will not part with her for all the gold in the world." At last, however, they had pity on him, and gave him the coffin. But the moment he lifted it up to carry it home with him, the piece of apple fell from between her lips, and Snowdrop awoke and said, "Where am I?" And the prince answered, "Thou art safe with me." Then he told her all that had happened, and said, "I love you better than all the world. Come with me to my father's palace, and you shall be my wife." And Snowdrop consented, and went home with the prince, and everything was prepared with great pomp and splendor for their wedding. To the feast was invited, among the rest, Snowdrop's old enemy the queen, and as she was dressing herself in fine rich clothes, she looked in the glass and said, "Tell me, glass, tell me true, of all the ladies in the land, who is fairest? Tell me who." And the glass answered, "Thou, lady, art loveliest here, I ween, but lovelier far is the new-made queen." When she heard this, she started with rage, but her envy and curiosity were as great, that she could not help setting out to see the bride. And when she arrived, and saw that it was no other than Snowdrop, who, as she thought, had been dead a long while, she choked with passion, and fell ill, and died. But Snowdrop and the prince lived and reigned happily over that land many, many years. Thank you very much for listening.